might just start with the acknowledgement, even if you want me to, Joe. So I'd like to acknowledge the land on where we're all meeting today. For me, it's Turrbal Yagara, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future.
So the project that you're participating in and why this is all free is it's been funded by the Community Broadcasting Foundation of Australia, which is the main funding body for the community broadcasting sector. And Radio 4EB have a long-standing partnership with Of One Mind and WOW Australia to work with them generally to document and do some live broadcasting from a real like an in-person festival. But we're continuing to work with WOW in this way as the world has changed, as you're all aware, for now. So this is really exciting because what it's meant is that we've been able to open this up to people all around the country, which is great. And I know we've got people from all around the country participating, which is fantastic. The other partner in the delivery of this is this Queensland Government Advancing Women in Business initiative. So that's the acknowledgements done. I'll hand over to Michelle and mute myself. If you have any questions just in terms of process, I'm going to be, while Michelle's delivering the training, monitoring the messaging. So if you just do it in chat, and then I'll interrupt Michelle at an appropriate time so that we can ask the questions. And Michelle's quite happy if you'd ask questions through the process. And if you're, and what would be great is if everyone could kind of keep their microphones muted as much as possible, just to save on background noise. And we'll track how we go in terms of video. But over to Michelle Brown. Thank you so much for agreeing to be our facilitator for this whole series. If you're not aware, we're doing 3 workshops over the next week and a half. Mostly they're open to everyone. And then what we're going to do for the 4th one is really work with people who are interested in creating podcasts and or are creating radio programs already and are part of the community broadcasting sector, to continue in a mentoring capacity to look at some topics, do some interviews, create some content that then can be shared via the well in the listener area, and also 4EB. And we have a national distribution platform called Community Radio Network, which means that really cool content we present to them and then they share it around the country. So if you're not a broadcaster already but you're interested, just send me a message and we can talk to you about that. But yeah, so the content, so the process is short-term training, and then there'll be a longer mentoring program that continues on post those 3 training sessions. And that's me done.
Thanks, Joe. That's great. So just to reiterate, happy for questions to be asked throughout. But yeah, if you can pop them in the chat, and Joe will help me to see those, because I'm going to be screen sharing. It gets a bit hard to monitor the chat. But at the end, we'll have a general Q&A session as well, so we can have a bit more of a thorough question time then. So just quickly, a little bit about me. My name is Michelle Brown. I know some of your faces. I do training for the Community Media Training Organisation. So it's a national training body for community broadcasting. But I also do training for State Library of Queensland and a few other different institutions. And this one that we're going to be doing today is podcasting basics. And it's one that I've sort of developed using a few resources for longer form training for podcasting. So usually with a more in-depth podcasting training session, we would run for anywhere from 6 hours to, I think the one at State Library is about 12 hours, and that's broken up. So today it's definitely going to be more of a basic introduction. And I know some of you are broadcasters, so you'll probably have a little bit more skill and knowledge than those that might not be broadcasters. But I'm hoping that we can just give you a basic good understanding of what you need and what podcasting means in this day and age. So thank you all for joining us. And what I'm going to do is start to share my screen. I've got a little slideshow so that we can go through some stuff together. And you should all now be able to see on screen podcasting with Michelle Brown. So everyone can see that okay? Thumbs up is always good for me. Yep, excellent. So that's just a little intro page. So what's a podcast? You know, and what is different about podcast from radio? So podcast, I guess, was coined back in about 2004, February 2004, by a Guardian journalist. And it came from the term iPod. So you might remember we had MP3 players, like iPods, before our phones became our listening devices. And there was I think it was NPR had started to do some recorded online audio. And so this journalist put two and two together, podcasting came up with podcasting. And ever since then, it started to take off and, you know, it's everyday life now. So what I usually like to sort of talk about to start with is what's the difference from podcast to traditional media like radio. And some of the main differences: the audience has the freedom to listen on the go. So they're able to download and listen to the audio broadcast at any time, while they're in the car, while they're doing the dishes, while they're jogging. And we know we can do this with radio, with on-demand these days, but with podcasting, you can subscribe using RSS feeds, which we're going to talk about a bit later. But one of the handy things for podcasting is the ability to subscribe to your favorites and listen whenever you want. You get to be notified when they put a new show up, and you can download to your favorite device or stream. One of the other main differences for podcasts to radio is that it can be about connecting a community around the world rather than more local, which is what radio is good at, particularly community radio. It's about your local communities. Sometimes these might be broader and across the world, but yeah, with podcasting, they can be very topic specific, very niche. Something that it does well with podcasting is the focus on storytelling and that one-on-one style conversation. In radio, you know, we need to think about, usually we're talking to a larger audience. With podcasting, some of the most successful ones are the ones that have that really one-on-one style conversation. So it feels like, you know, they're your friend after you've been tuning in for a while, and you look forward to hearing, you know, the next episode. So that's just a few little bits about what makes podcasting a little different to traditional. What you need to do a podcast, and we're going to go into more detail as we go for these ones, but these are your basics. This is what you're going to need. If you want to start a podcast, then it's not a matter of just going, oh, I've got a phone, it has a recorder in it, let me just start recording myself speaking. You still need to do planning. You need to have equipment that will help you. So let's just go through some of those things that you will need. Obviously, content. And this is your main one, because engaging content is central to podcasting, and it's also your topic. Your content topics might be what sets you apart from other podcasters. There's literally millions of podcasts out there now. There's a lot of podcast makers, and it's hard to become, you know, one of those really successful podcasters if you don't have, I guess, content that's going to engage either a really specific audience or a more general audience. We talked about niche content before, so that's, you know, it might not matter the size of your audience, but you need to at least have a even a small group that's going to regularly download and listen to your podcast. We'll talk more about content shortly, but just to keep going, recording equipment. Now, this is very key to whether you can also deliver a successful podcast, because audio quality is one of the issues that with beginner podcasts, if you just don't have that audio quality there to begin with, you won't get people coming back to listen to your podcast. If it's difficult for them to listen, and just remember that with most people, when they're listening to podcasts, they do have headphones on generally, so you know they can hear the pops and bad audio like buzzing and background sound and those type of things. So you do need some good recording equipment or access to a good studio that you can record in, so that you give a good listening experience. Once you've recorded that content, you're going to need to edit it, because unless you're like a very, very experienced broadcaster or audio presenter, then you're probably going to have some ums and ahs and mistakes and issues in your recording that you might want to remove. And you also want to package that recorded content up so it gives the best listening experience. We all know that, you know, most people will have some, what I call idiosyncrasies in the way they speak, ums and ahs. I do a lot of you knows because I've tried to replace my ums and ahs, and I end up with a you know, because that's a bridging thought. That's that, you know, your brain's trying to catch up with what you're trying to deliver. Don't be afraid of too many ums and ahs, because you also want natural and relatable sounding content. And we'll talk a little bit more later on the delivery and the recording. But editing, you will get to know where you want to cut out things like your ums and ahs or any issues. And editing software, we'll probably talk a little bit about Audacity, and I know a lot of the broadcasters, and I see a lot of the faces in this session that, you know, we've done some Audacity training together before, and it's a free and open source software, so it is available for anyone to download. You also need, for podcasting, you need a host server and a distribution platform. So you might have, particularly if you've got a radio show, you might have already got the content, you've recorded equipment and you've edited it down, and now you've got this piece of audio that you think is, oh, this is going to make a great podcast. How do you get it out there on the internet? How do you get it out there so that people can find it amongst the, you know, thousands and thousands of other podcasts? So with a host server or distribution platform, this makes it pretty easy, and they kind of, depending on which one you go with, they have some great systems where it's basically you upload it and you check a few boxes, put a few words in and deliver it out there, and it gets found by podcatchers, which we'll talk about shortly. So a host server distribution platform, that's an internet server where you're putting your podcast episodes up, basically. You'll need a host web page. So generally, if you sign up for a host server or distribution platform, then that will provide you with a website where your audience can find and subscribe to it. And it generates an RSS feed that you can use, which we'll talk a little bit more about shortly. And of course, once you've got your podcast up, it's online, it's ready for people to find and listen, you need a digital strategy or a promotional plan that can ensure that you have a way to get your podcast out there so you can gain listeners and followers. Does it make sense for everyone? so far? All good? Excellent.
Michelle?
Yes.
One question that's come through is what constitutes good audio quality example of special software? From Fran.
Yep. Okay, great. So I guess good audio quality is something where people, when they're listening, they're not hearing that fuzzy background noise that you can sometimes hear. If you try and record, for example, just straight with your phone's recording, you'll probably hear a fair bit of background noise. There's humming of air conditioners, you know, winds, those type of things. When you are speaking, there might be pops and bits that your mic will pick up. I don't have a pop filter or a mic sock on this mic right now, which is not ideal. I don't know where my pop filter is, so that's why it's not on there. But when you are recording, you can hear those things. And so I guess what we're talking about with audio quality is a good listening experience for people. When you listen back to it, besides maybe cringing at the sound of your own voice, if you're not used to it, you will get used to it after editing a long while. You can hear what makes good audio. And what my suggestion is people starting out with podcasting is to look at the top 10 podcasts, you know, who's rating the highest at the moment. Might not be of your interest of any of those things. It probably will be true crime because that is the most popular genre of podcasting still. Listen to their audio and see what that sounds like, because that'll give you an idea. An example of a podcast that started out in the first episode was pretty bad audio, and they kind of realized that, and you could tell from episode 2 how much better it sounded, and that was the Teacher's Pet podcast series. So it was an Australian series that came out of Guardian newspaper story. No, maybe not Guardian. I can't remember which newspaper, but you can really tell the difference between the first episode and then episodes after that, because they realized, oh, we're onto something here. This is a popular topic people are interested in, but we need to do something about the audio quality because people gave that feedback. Now, editing software, I think, was the second part of that question. We'll talk a little bit more about that shortly, so I'll leave that one for now. And we'll move to the next page. I think, was there a few more questions on this? No, good. Okay, so podcast styles. Just moving you all over on my little video here. There's quite a few different types of podcasts, and this is generally up to the person who's making the podcast. If you're doing it as a group, then, you know, that will be a decision that you'll come together. And generally, as a listener, you might have a preference of what you prefer when you're listening to podcasts too. But these are the general overview of what different styles that you could go with. So the interview style, and this is probably one of the ones that's more similar to radio programming, is that you will have generally, you know, you'll have the same hosts every episode, but you might have and you might have some regular guests that come in, but you might have a few like new guests every week or every episode, because it's that interview style. You may do a solo podcast, so this is just one person. It might cover specific topics or lots of different ones. There's the panel show, so kind of similar to the interview style, but this I guess it's a group of hosts discussing different topics relating to the podcast main focus. So for example, you might have a tech show that has a group of people who are interested in technology, and week to week they might cover a different piece of technology that's come out and the pros and cons, that type of style. We also have the conversational co-hosted podcast. This is similar to interview, but a bit more casual. This is probably one of the more popular ones too. So the beauty of podcasting is that it can be that conversational style where it's the presenter is talking to you like you are a mate, a friend, and you're having that kind of two-way conversation, but it's just one way, but you feel like you're part of that. Then we have the storytelling, which is very popular because this kind of falls, I guess, into the, it could be historical content or fictional. It can include a couple of hosts or just one, but these are like the true crime podcasts where, you're telling a story, giving it a little bit of feeling and drama. And generally it's a true story or a historical event or something that's happened. Then we have the audio drama. So this is like a radio play, pretty much, created from a fictional story, and you can have people playing characters, that kind of style. So you might have a mix of all of these in your one style of podcast that you want to create, but this is just a little overview of what the general way that you can sort of pigeonhole the podcast styles. So when you are thinking about creating a podcast, you need to have preparation, just like with anything that projects that you're planning, radio shows, events, what have you, you need to prepare and have a pretty good idea of what you want to do before you just get into it. And that's the same for podcasting, particularly every episode. You want to think about what you're going to be recording and putting together, because the more you plan, then the better. Oh, excuse me, large motorbike truck. You want to make sure that you are not spending a lot of time recording and having to edit. If you're prepared and you know what you're going to record and what you're going to need to put your podcast together, you're going to save yourself time, energy, everything basically, because you want to have a good idea of how your episode is going to run before you even hit record. So scripting, this is something that will be up to you. You may want to just go with dot points to make sure in your podcast that you are going to be talking and covering everything that you want to. You might want to have no script at all and totally wing it, or you might fully script your podcast and read from that. I'm not going to tell you which way is the best way to go for you, because you will work that out, but I would suggest that that middle ground of dot points usually works well, because if you're fully scripting, then you may sound like you're just reading from a script, and in some cases for podcasting that can work. Other times it will just sound like you're reading something. And if you do try and wing it, then you might forget some of the really important stuff that you wanted to cover, particularly if it's a community issue that you're trying to represent and talk about. So there might be a women's group that you want to focus on some social issues. So, for that kind of example podcast, maybe you all have dot points, and you make sure that when you're having that conversation of recording together, that you all have different points that you want to raise and cover, which could sound nice and conversational, not scripted, but not winging it.
Michelle, I've got a question from Ruth, which says, can an author do their book on a podcast as opposed to using ebooks, as you said, take it anywhere without reading?
You could, but you will need to make sure that you have all your legalities and copyright things sorted as well, because if you're an author and you want to produce this, then you have to give yourself permission. But if it was someone else's book that you were reading, then no, you would definitely need to get permission and licensing for that one. But if it's your own book, then yeah, why not? You could release that as an audio podcast series rather than an audio ebook. And and that just depends on, you know, if you think that's a good way to go. So I would just look and see what's out there, see how others have gone with that style, the, you know, fictional or non-fiction books turned into podcasts, and if they've been as popular as ebooks. I guess the thing with ebooks is that people go to ebooks to find them as well. So if it was me, I'd probably have both, if you're to make sure you get maximum audience. So scripting, we've chatted about. Interviews. Are you know, these are the things you need to think about in your episode preparation. If you're having a guest on your show, you know, do you want to prepare a list of questions for them? Do you want to send it to those questions to them before you start recording with them, so they're prepared, they can think about it? Do you want to keep them on their toes and not prepare them with a list of questions? So that's something you could think about. If you have multiple people you want to interview on your show, do you want to record them individually? So, you know, that you're editing with just one-on-one style conversation, or do you want to try and get a group of people together to have that interview? These are the things you might want to think about. So sound effects and music, SFX, that's short for sound effects, and backing music. So this is where you need to think about licensing and copyright, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But if you want to make your content engaging, you might want to think about how you use music and sound effects, even if that's just an opening little jingle or, you know, pre-recorded sting. This is where we move into the next one. That's your pre-recorded. So that might be your general, your podcast's ID. So, you know, welcome each week. See if I can remember mine from my old podcast is, you're listening to Press Pause. This is a weekly show about animals and humans. It wasn't quite that, but.
Can I ask a quick question myself, just in terms of that and using music? If it's, because I know music is a big thing with podcasts and licensing. So can you use, if you had something composed?
Yep. So if you actually got someone to create some backing music for you, and you know they've given you written permission, then sure. And we'll talk about free music options a bit later, because there's plenty out there. There is a whole bunch of places you can go online and download sound effects and backing music. But it's also really great to see if you can use your local musicians that might want to collaborate with you. And, you know, it'd be nice if you could pay them, but maybe if they're starting out, they're happy to do it as a contra style arrangement. So you acknowledge them every week and they get, you know, their music on your podcast. But sound effects, you know, things can be just like if you were doing for example, I did have a podcast called Press Pause, and I'll show you some stuff about that later. But obviously, because it was about animals and our pets, we had a lot of dogs barks and cat meows and chicken bok boks. So you know, we would disperse those in our podcast for relevant things, just to keep it a little bit fun and not just straight voice delivery. And having pre-recorded elements, so it helps with having a bit of a formula of how you might run your episode, and this is why I always suggest, and I will at the end post a link to a basic run sheet that is just a template I've created, which is so if you're in radio, you know run sheets are pretty integral for, you know, show planning. If you have interview or heavy intensive style programs, and that can be help you organize yourself. So, you know, maybe you have a pre-recorded start, then you have a general chat about what you're going to have on your show and so forth. We'll talk a bit more about that soon. I just wanted to mention the last one in your episode preparation. If you are covering something that might not be suitable for all listeners, such as has explicit or difficult content, swearing, then you still want to put some content warnings in your podcast at the start. Is probably a good idea to warn people there might be some content coming up that might not be suitable for all listeners. Question? Nope. Okay. So we're just going to talk about what you need to get your content recorded. So the main thing is, I guess, ability to record your vocals with little sound interference. If you're just starting out and don't have access to a studio, there's a basic list of things you'll need. But I always recommend considering, rather than spending the money on buying all these items to start with, and you're not sure whether podcasting is going to be for you long term, then see if you can find a local studio radio station that offers hire. 4EB, for example, has studios that are available. And I know most cities have community radio stations that would probably be open to hiring out their studios for you to use. Some libraries also have rooms available. State Library of Queensland has a recording studio, but it is very popular and hard to get into because it's free. I also know in Brisbane there's another actual podcast studio in West End somewhere, not too sure where, but you can just Google podcast studios in your local area to see what might pop up, because this might save you if you use a studio that already has microphones, mixers, everything you need to record, then that will definitely save you some money to start with, because some of the things you'll need include mics. So you'll need a microphone, and generally with the microphone you might need a lead and a pop filter. So I mentioned pop filters before. I don't have one on this mic. I'm just gonna. So this is about $120, $30 mic that I bought a while ago. It's an Audio Technica, and I've just got it on a stand here. It should have a mic sock or a pop filter on it, but like I mentioned, I cannot find those, so I'll have to buy more. But it's a cardioid mic, and it is powered, so it's not a USB mic. It needs an actual microphone XLR lead, and it needs a little audio interface box for it to plug into, so it doesn't just pop straight into a computer. But you can buy USB mics, so this is where you won't need another audio interface. You can just plug a mic using USB straight into your computer. I'm not going to tell you which is better, because there's so much discussion out there of what the best mics are and what aren't. Generally, I suggest you do a little research of, top 10 mics that you can buy for podcasting, because a lot of the tech sites will do this every few months. They'll give you a rundown of what the best mics might be. And generally, I work with a lot of men in my other workplace who are all experts in audio, and even they have differing opinions, and we can argue all day about what the best mics are, but generally I just suggest just doing some Googling and top 10 podcast mics.
We might also, when we do a follow-up email post-training, give some suggestions from our tech team here, because we've just all moved to remote broadcast over the last couple of weeks. So we've got all sorts of amazing setups and recommendations.
That'd be great. I think, it's good to, particularly I think radio broadcasters are used to this stuff, so they can give you some good tips. So I mentioned audio interface. This is generally a little, it's not a mixer, because you can't really mix your audio, but it is a device that plugs your mics or your outputs, like your headphones, and then goes into your computer. You'll need a mic stand, be it a desk stand if you're going to be recording at your computer at your desk. You'll need headphones, because recording and monitoring your audio with headphones is pretty integral for any audio. And soundproofing. So my house is definitely not soundproof. This room that I'm in, I'm in a 100-year-old cottage with flimsy walls. Every time a car goes past, you know, you can hear that. But it's good enough for what we're doing here for presentation styles. And thank you. My timed coffee has arrived. So soundproofing, it's really hard to achieve at home. Another project that we've been working on with my other work is creating a little soundproof booth with free and open source plans that people could build and make, but that is still going to cost $5,000 for people. You can buy the small little shields, soundproof shields for mics. They're only about, I think, $50 on eBay. So they're an okay alternative for helping with soundproofing. You need a computer because you'll need to edit. You could use your phone for some of this stuff, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But generally, you will still need a computer because you're going to have to upload, and editing on your computer is a lot easier than trying to edit on a phone or a small screen. And you need that software for editing and generally a web browser for uploading. Handy items that will help you with audio recording and podcasting. Portable audio recorder. So for example, like a Zoom recording device. Those in radio are probably familiar with those. These can range from $200 up to $700. They are good if you want to go out and interview people. So as part of the WOW event planning originally, you know, we would have had some people going out and interviewing at the event, talking to people. And so we would have been using portable audio recorders for those. Or you can buy, and these days, I kind of recommend these if you have a really good mobile iPhone or an Android phone that has really good audio capture capabilities. You can buy little mics and adapters that plug in, which are really great. So, you could probably buy one of those for $150 or something, turn your phone into a portable audio recorder. Just keep in mind that audio capture can take up a large amount of space. So if you don't have much hard drive space on your mobiles, etc., then you need to sort of think about that. Any questions on the equipment side of things before we move to the next slide? No.
Sorry, I should be more onto it.
No, that's okay.
Charmaine, headphones, would these be needed by the interviewer as well as the interviewee if your podcast was an interview style type?
I would say yes, because it would be great for both of you to be hearing the quality audio well. However, if you're using a portable device and you're out in the field, it might be hard to have that 2 headphone setup. So it would just be you as the interviewer who had that. But if you're in a studio space, just like in your radio studio, your guests should have headphones on like you would, so that they can hear really well. Yep. So editing content. I talked earlier about, you will need some software to help you edit once you've recorded and captured. So we're going to look at a few options just now. I always start by recommending Audacity, because it's free open source software, which means that that it's available for anyone to download. It works on Mac, Windows, Linux, and it can be a little bit daunting. It's not the prettiest of software, can scare people, but it is capable of doing what you need. And yeah, my main thing with Audacity is that it can just, you know, if you're used to using sort of traditional other applications like the Adobe software, then it can be a little bit hard because the shortcuts are different and just the interface can be a little bit more difficult for some people. But other popular software includes the Adobe Audition. So Adobe Audition, I think it's because Adobe is a subscription-based model, it will cost you on a monthly fee. Pro Tools is more of a industry audio standard one that's quite expensive. I only recommend it if you're really into audio and you might already have experience with it. Usually it's used for production. For a lot of radio stations will use it in their production departments, and usually you have had a bit of training to be able to use that one. But it's all of these are quite similar. They have that digital audio workstations. DAWs is something what they, I guess, fall under, and you know, there's ability to choose your inputs and outputs, so you can choose your mics that you know you're using to record. You can see the recordings. Logic Pro is another one that is more production based, and it's Mac only, I think. Ableton Live is one that I know a lot of younger musicians like Ableton, and it's not that expensive. If you have a Mac, generally it comes with GarageBand. GarageBand's fine. It's super easy to use for this type of podcast editing and recording. And one that I really like is Hindenburg. It is more of a radio, they call it Hindenburg, like you can buy the journalist account. I think there's a basic model. It's not that expensive, but it's a nice looking interface. And it
so
already...
Can you use Audacity with iOS?
Yes, yes. Well, actually, because on your iPad or your iPhone, are you thinking? Because iOS is the mobile Mac operating system. So I'm not actually sure if you could use it on your mobile, possibly. You would just have to see if it's available in the App Store. But if you have a Mac computer, yes, you can use it. But yeah, I would say if you haven't played around with any, download Audacity because it's free. It's the one you could start with having a play and then take it from there. On this screenshot, you should be able to see a little screenshot I've taken. This is Hindenburg, and just why I like Hindenburg is because of this layout, basically, because it already kind of sets your structure up for you. And you can do this with Audacity. You could name each of your recorded channels, but I like to record and do a basic edit in Audacity, and then I'll bring my content into Hindenburg and set it up to package. So I think I didn't capture the first channel, but and the start of this, but this is one of a screenshot from one of our press pause recordings. This is a couple of years ago, but you're missing the part where I have the intro recording. So, you know, that's where it starts, our intro. And then with this one, because we recorded it for radio as well, we had music. So then there was a song, and then there's a speaking channel, there's an interview channel. So it comes with these sort of names already, and you can change those names, but it's just a nice way of getting you focused on how you might package the content that you've recorded and how that can end up for your podcast. But generally, the same with most things, I guess storytelling and even radio shows, you've got a start, a middle, and an end. So the start of your podcast would probably be an introduction, and you might want to create a jingle or a sting that kicks off the episode, and keep that kind of short, 10, 15 seconds, and then you might want to introduce yourself, the name of your podcast, and what the episode will be covering. I think it's good to, unlike radio, you don't have to repeat who you are and what the program is throughout the episode, but at the start and the finish, it's a good idea, because generally people have found your podcast, they're going to listen to it. So, and they're going to usually listen, they're not going to tune in halfway through. So that's why you don't really have to keep introducing like you would in radio. So the middle part of your podcast is going to be your main content. So, is that you in a group of others talking about a specific topic? Is that some interviews that you've captured on a general topic? What have you? And then you want to end it with a sign off. Thank you for listening. Subscribe, tell your friends, go to our Facebook, give us a like, all the usual type of things you do to wrap up an audio or video broadcast. It's a nice idea if you know to tell them what might be featured on the next episode, because that will keep them coming back and downloading and listening. Yeah. And so again, just some of the main things you probably want to include: intros and outros, name of your podcast, the host of the podcast, purpose of your podcast, and any other important info like sponsors or disclaimers. Cool. So the fun stuff, legalities and copyright. So a lot of people kind of think, well, podcasts, they're not, traditional media as such, and they're worldwide. Why do I have to care about any of this stuff? Well, they're still bound by certain regulations, and they aren't bound as strictly to the ACMA, which is for radio and television, the Australian Communications and Media Authority. So that codes of practice. So rules around swearing and offensive material might not as apply as such, but other broadcast laws and regulations do, such as defamation, copyright, racial vilification, and so on, because podcasting is a form of publishing. You can read more, and I'm going to send these slides through. Hopefully I can send that at the end. So, and some links to some other material. But the Creative Commons blog post, vodcast and wiki copyright guide for Australia, which is quite old, I think it was released in 2009, but it is still relevant for podcasting. So that's a good one to sort of read through. A link I'll put in here. You'll also have different podcasting platforms that might have their own requirements for when it comes to copyright material. So read the fine print about any services you might use to distribute. So any platforms you might distribute your content on. So including music can be a big headache for podcasting. And this is radio stations pay fees every year to APRA, AMCOS and PPCA to cover their licensing for playing music. And if you wanted to include that in your podcast, you would also have to pay quite a big some fees to cover those. So that's why I mentioned that you can find great copyright-free music out there. You could, if you know local musicians, friends that can create music, make sure you still get in writing, create a little agreement so that you both have a copy of that. So if you do use music for your podcast that they've given you, you have some kind of written agreement. But keep in mind, if they're on a label and they still give you written agreement, that might not hold up, because if the label has the rights to the music as well, you want to make sure that that's all covered. So generally, you can do a lot more than you can, I guess, with traditional media with what you can feature, and I guess swearing's a big one. But do you really need to? Think about, will my podcast be better if it has lots of swearing and offensiveness in it? I think that's really up to you and what your program podcast might cover. Okay, so hosting. So this is the one where most people, they might have an idea of audio recording and, radio programming, all that kind of stuff. But this is where most people are like, oh, I don't know actually how to get my podcast out there. So we're just going to talk a little bit about that. And hosting is generally, you want to prepare your episodes for hosting and distribution. So I just want to quickly talk about metadata. I imagine most people would have a little bit of an understanding of what metadata is, particularly if you've listened to music through some playout systems like iTunes. You can see items in the track that are assigned with the track, such as track title, albums, year of release, the artist, and those have been input so that they can provide metadata and they can be tracked. And when you are recording and you go to export your audio, so for example in Audacity, you'll get asked to fill in these fields once you hit the export button. And it's important that you actually have some kind of continuity included here. So it might be that the track name is the name of the podcast episode. So, press pause episode 1. The album might be press pause podcast. And the artist would just be press pause podcast as well. It'll be up to you, or your distribution platform might require something specific, so you can read about that. But generally, you just want to know the year, the names, and the basic stuff. And RSS feed is really the one that's important for podcasting, because you may recall, if you've been a user on the internet for a number of years, that you used to, I guess, subscribe to RSS feeds for a lot of news content. And so, on websites, you could go, oh, subscribe to a news feed, and then you could see the news sort of real-time updating. And RSS feeds is just rich site summary, and it's a simple way of staying up to date with delivery of content, because when you upload onto these distribution platforms, they'll usually set you up with an RSS feed, and then that goes out to places like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other, podcatchers, so where you actually can go and find podcasts to listen. So you need that RSS feed to actually get people, subscribing and finding your podcast. And I'll show you, because I've got on my screen the Whooshkaa, so some of the popular hosting platforms I've listed here. I chose Whooshkaa for our Press Pause one a couple of years ago because it was free for a lot of community and smaller podcasters. And I still think there's a lot of free options available with it. Podbean is another one very popular, I would recommend, but there's a few here that I've listed. SoundCloud is a free one, but you're limited to the amount of content you can put up without having to pay. So I'm just going to jump to Whooshkaa so you can see what it's like in one of these distribution platforms. You can all see that changed the tab, right? So now you can see the Whooshkaa screen. Yeah, anyone give me a thumbs up there? Yeah, cool, thanks. I just wanted to make sure that the screen sharing was okay across tabs. So I've logged in. This is the interface that you see for Whooshkaa. I've already created a show. So, you can see press pause. But if you were to, I'm like, oh, maybe I want to create a new podcast, then, you could create a show, you give it a title, some descriptions. Is it episodic? Is it serial? How many seasons? All the different things that you might need to include. And they have some great options, like even normalize loudness, so that can help with getting your sound to be similar to other podcasters. We'll just go back and have a look at what we have here. So here's press pause. This is one that we did a few years ago. When you set up a show, you have your overview. You can put in your public show page, and it's created an RSS feed. So this is the one I'm talking about earlier. So then you can copy this and use this for distribution, because that's your assigned RSS feed URL. However, there's some really easy things, particularly in Whooshkaa, which helps you just set up. So this is already set up for Spotify and Deezer. So all you had to do was submit, and that sometimes takes a couple of weeks. Apple Podcasts, it is part of Apple Podcasts, because I looked at this last night and I'm like, why do I have to submit again? And I don't know why it's still there, but we are on Apple Podcasts. The Google Podcast one I found is a little trickier. There's a little bit more you need to do. So it's only a new thing. So I'm going to have to investigate a little bit more on why they made that so difficult, rather than just hitting a submit button. You have to change some coding, which is a bit of a pain for most people. Excuse me. Then there's an option 2, which is great, an embed show option. So this is terrific. So for example, if you have a website or even a radio program, you could embed your program in your own website by using this embed code. And you can see, like, you know, you can automatically, that podcast is there for people to listen to, and you can see all the other episodes. So things as tabs at the top shows you all the episodes. It will have listeners, published dates. I've got no highlights. You can, so with highlights, you can create little short clips, which would be great if you had interviews with someone, like, so if you have regular interviews, but there was just a, you know, couple of minutes you wanted to focus on. I don't think we have any reviews, so that one's got nothing for us. And then manage access, so you can provide other people access to jump in. So what is great about all these distribution sites, besides the fact of, you know, you get your audio up there and it kind of helps you distribute it out, you don't have to do much, is that the insights are what you're going to use a lot of, particularly if you want to start making some kind of money from podcasts, be it you want to put some advertising in there, then the advertisers are going to want to know some stats. And there's things like, so we're not going to, I'm even surprised anyone would still be listening to our show, because we haven't even probably logged in for a couple of years. But they're great. Like, you know, the stats are what you're going to be looking at a lot to see, oh, what countries are listening, you know, tuning in. So interestingly, France for us. Not sure why that might be. Maybe we played a French song or something. But this stuff is really cool, particularly if you're into, you know, data. You can see what kind of devices people are listening on, phones, desktops. So, you know, you can see for this one, I guess, where people have come from or what clients they're using. So Spotify, other, which means they're probably not allowing tracking operating systems. So you can see iOS, Android, Mac, other. Again, people have probably turned off any tracking. So insights are terrific if you're a data nerd and, you know, really interested to see how your podcast is going. And I think there's things where you could put transcribe audio content. So I didn't really investigate much of this stuff. And campaigns are, if you wanted to try and help get your podcast out there, then that can help, I believe. So yeah, that's just a sort of a little look at the behind the scenes of a distribution platform. And I'm pretty sure the others will all be very similar. And this is one that I think is the main difference between if you're doing radio and podcasting. This is the sort of stuff that will be a big difference. Just before we go on to the promotion, is there any questions just about the distribution platforms?
Not that I've got.
Terrific. I just wanted an excuse to drink a bit of coffee. So promotion, just like any new content, event, whatever that you're doing, you kind of need to promote it. Otherwise you're in a silo and you might just be busting out a whole bunch of work on these podcasts and then no one's listening. So some of the things you want to think about: a promotional plan. That's always a good start. Think about creating a website, even if that's just a blog or something free WordPress site. A Facebook page could also be. I just kind of recommend trying to steer clear of having just a social media page as your main website, I guess, or main place to send people, because people are moving to, a lot of younger people are moving away from places such as Facebook. So, you know, just think about if you do that, you might need to have a few different options so that you know, make sure people can access without having to log in or sign up for something they might not want to. But social media is definitely something you'll need to incorporate as well. So you can have a Facebook page, you can have an Instagram page, Twitter account, but make sure you're using those. Don't just create all these avenues and then they just sit idle, because that can also be detrimental, because people might go and they're like, there's nothing new here. So if you're going to use social media, make sure it's a regular part of your promotion. So every episode you might have, maybe you have a little plan that says, okay, the week before I'm going to update on our website about what is the next episode is about. So a little synopsis about the next episode. And then on socials, you can share that out with some images to say coming up in next week. And then maybe the day before you do another post. Don't forget, tune in tomorrow, new release of our episode. And then the day that the episode's up, new episode out. Don't forget to subscribe, download, all the rest of it. So, you know, think about a regular type plan, because that will help you stay on top of it. Other things to think about, a media contact list. So maybe you want to make sure that you're getting the word out about your podcast a bit further afield. So just like with, you know, an event planning or something like that, you might have a media contact list and you can send a press release about the new podcast starting. I would love to get an interview to talk about what this podcast might be covering, things like that. So, and try and get some press, or find those websites that feature a specific podcast, new podcasts, things like that. Make sure you're sending them press releases or information so that they can alert their audience to a new podcast on the scene, things like that. Cross promo with other podcasters is great, works quite well. So because they already have a podcast audience, listening audience. So, you know, if you can share across, if you're, you know, quite different, you don't want to be in competition, but if you've got different styles of podcasts, different topics, which most people will have, it's a nice way of plugging each other and getting some listeners. I recommend joining any Facebook groups that are dedicated to podcasts, because they will very much be real helpful for, particularly when you're starting out, just for tips and tricks, and to just share stories and other things like that. So in Brisbane, we have Brisbane Podcasters Group on Facebook. So that's a handy one to be part of. I'm pretty sure most cities would have similar, and there's international ones as well.
So I have a question from Ruth. Does having your own app work well with having podcasts on there?
So if you've got your own app and you're like, yeah, have a section for podcasts, look, it wouldn't hurt, but I would suggest that most people are going to find your podcast by using one of the traditional podcatchers. So, you know, Spotify, Apple, like they'll go and search and subscribe that way, because if you're a podcast listener, so I use Apple Podcasts because I have an iPhone and it's probably a bit bright, but I've subscribed to a bunch of podcasts, so it pops up to let me know when new episodes have arrived, and gives me details of, you know, what's coming up and new things. So that's generally where people are going to be going mainly to find podcasts. But it wouldn't hurt to definitely have your own, and, you know, embed, which is what we do with Press Pause. We had our own webpage and we embedded it there, and people can subscribe that way. But yeah, it'll end up being what's best for you. But I'd make sure that I was as everywhere as I can be. And I'm sure we can talk about the 4EB, how it might work for 4EB later on. Because yeah, you can, I know with some of the web pages on radio programs, you could embed it in there for your regular listeners to find that way.
Yep. And we have been hosting some, so yeah, already.
Just last thing I wanted on promotion, have a launch party. Give me any excuse for a party, but yeah, like just that physical event will help you just get a bit of excitement and give you that, I guess, connect to your local community, because why not? Fun.
Yeah, we I think Maureen, who's on here, hi Maureen, how are you? Did a 10-part series after WOW 2018 on women in the Pacific and the impacts of climate change, and it was called No Land, No Livelihood, No Home. And that one we turned into podcasts, and it's been disseminated, available. But we had a fantastic listening party here at the station to launch that. So we invited a bunch of people, politicians, speakers, interviewees, and community members, and that was really nice when we're allowed to gather again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or have a Zoom party as launch if we're stuck like this for a long time. Yeah, just think about fun ways for launching. So audience metrics, I kind of showed you a bit of this in the back end of Whooshka, but I just wanted to cover why, you know, metrics are important. They kind of just help you work out whether you have listeners, how you can sort of grow your audience, knowing where your audience is from. I think that personalizing is always good. So, for example, you release a podcast, you see, oh, we had a really big audience from the UK. So maybe in the next episode, you could mention that, oh, last week's audience, we had great listenership from United Kingdom. Shout out to all those, UK folk, that kind of stuff. Just because then I think, that's bringing that connection back in that one-on-one. They feel like, oh, they noted that I was around type stuff. One of my favorite podcasts, it's true crime, sorry. My favorite murder is a long-running show. Two ladies, loud and obnoxious, fantastic ladies from California, who just talk about, some of the famous murders. They connect really well with their audience. They're one of the ones internationally that have really built a community. They actually have a name, and the community themselves gave themselves these names, and they're like, there's a lot of obsession with it. So the Murderinos is their little community. They sell merch, they have live events. It's worked really well for them. They now have their own podcast business, I guess, where they have other podcasters on board. So these ladies have really dominated and killed it in the game, which is great. But yeah, they've been doing it for a long while, and they were pretty successful early on. So, you know, some of the things that will help you build your audience is understanding your audience. And most of your distribution platforms, or hosting service providers, should help you with this data. You can use Google Analytics as well for things like your web stats, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the main things that we wanted to talk you through for the basics of podcasting. So I guess now I want to open it up for people to have a chat and to ask a bit more and cover things in a little bit more detail if we need it. So I might just stop share for a moment so I can see all your faces again. Oh, I lost you. How are you all doing? We still good? Excellent. Great. I'm happy if you all, you know, if you want to ask questions, maybe, you know, unmute yourself. We probably don't need Joe to monitor as such, but just keep in mind not to speak over each other. So. Sorry, hand, was that Clarissa or Lara? I wonder there was a hand that went up quickly, but I missed it. Nope.
Everyone can unmute themselves. If anyone's got any questions.
Yes, iPad 4, sorry, I don't have your name
yes,
on there.
Yes, it's Fran here from Adelaide. I have a question, but it's more associated with community broadcasting. One of my favourite programs on 4EB is the Italian program, because I'm learning Italian and I loved the music and the songs. I have already emailed but not got a response. Maybe they're busy, no idea. But how can I access the names of the singers, say, in a particular program, and so the names of the singers and the name of the song, so I can then go online to download the lyrics so I can learn them? Any suggestions?
Yeah, you can send if you send an email to info@4eb.org.au, then Sylvia will chase it up with the broadcasters.
And some radio.
Okay. I've done that already. Okay. Yeah.
And some radio programs will have song lists that they put up, but it's harder. It's a lot harder for some of the ethnic broadcasters to have some of their music available as well, because it's all very
Old.
Well, that as niche.
Final.
Yeah.
Old is okay. The language that I'm focusing on, you know.
Yeah.
There's some great music on that program.
The other option, if you're listening to the on-demand version, so if it's not live, you can use, there's some apps you can find that you can play a piece of music and it will try and identify it for you. I'm having a mental blank. Shazam. The name of the app is called Shazam. So you could try that as well.
So is there any other podcasty related questions, Rosa?
Unmute yourself, Rosa.
I've got it.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for your presentation, Michelle. It's very helpful. But what would be your advice on someone beginning to podcast? So is there a way to do a pilot program? How can you test the waters? You know, do you start local and then go global? How does it work? How do you start in that way?
Good question. And what I would probably do is, create a little bit of a demo podcast. So, you know, a pilot demo idea, which was kind of, you know, your first attempt of what you might want to do and sound like. And I would get all my friends and family and community that I could get to have a listen to that. So before I put it out on distribution, I'd say, here's my pilot podcast. Can you give it a listen? And I'd love feedback. Because that's going to be a really good way to start, because that feedback might come back with stuff that you haven't even thought about. And you can go, okay, I can fix those things easily. Then start, you know, re-record, redo if you need to. If it sounds great, people don't have any feedback except, no, great, terrific, then you can use that as your first podcast. You know, it's episode 1, you pop it up.
Yes, but your friends and families, you know, always they will always tell you nice things. But
Will
how
they?
can you?
Mine won't.
But how can you be sure that you are targeting the you know, if you how do you find your niche?
Yeah, well, this is where I would use the Facebook groups. So
right.
the Brisbane podcast one, I know some people will put up their first episode and ask for feedback from the group.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And you'll usually get some pretty, what do you call it? Constructive feedback, because they're your competitors kind of thing. So they'll be a good way that you get that.
Great tip. Thanks.
Yes, Ruth.
Yeah, I've got a module I'm working on that I want to put on as a podcast, but I want to sell it. So, you know, there's Whooshka, and I've got Buzzsprouts. That's what I'm using, but I haven't tested Buzzsprout yet. But all those platforms you said before, they're the 10 top ones, but are they the 10 top for wanting to sell the modules in a podcast form?
No, so they were just the, I guess, the top ones that are popular for people, and I haven't investigated all of them, but I assume that the majority of them have ways that you can make money. I guess it's hard to sell a podcast itself. It's generally about advertising, so you know, you're selling yourself really. So I don't know if you listen to a lot of podcasts, even vodcasts, so you know, YouTube talk shows and things like that. It's the hosts talking about a product. For example, got some mascara here. So it would be, you know, you're listening to Press Pause. We use Super Curler mascara because it doesn't test on animals, so it's our preferred mascara of choice. You know, that you want to, it's from you, the advertising, and it's related to your podcast in some way is the best way that you can get money. But there's subscription models. So for Ruth, what you might want to do is have it on a paywall. So you might not be able to, using those distribution platforms, you might not be able to have a, you know, pay here to listen, but you could have something like Patreon, which to access every episode of, you know, my podcast, you have to subscribe to my Patreon, you know, $5 a month, and you'll get free access, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. And, you know, related always, because I have a bit of a marketing advertising background, I suggest, you know, $5 a month, that's a coffee. You know, you're buying me a coffee to help me produce my podcast. So making sure people aren't, you know, you're not just give me $5, relate it.
There's another question, Michelle. What duration is ideal for a podcast, i.e. under 25 minutes or 60 minutes? Could it be content or could it be content based?
Good question. And yes.
Can I just answer quickly from, in terms of the project we're doing, we are looking at the 2 options of an hour and half an hour, but there'll be very specific timelines like 27 minutes or 56 minutes. So because that fits the CRN national distribution model. So yeah, so I think it depends on where it's going to end up.
Totally. And again, yeah, it will relate to the content and where you're going to want to get it out there. So CRN has time limits, but generally, you know, they can range from 20 minutes to 2 hours. Like I suggest if you have a ballpark that you can keep most of them to, but unlike a radio show where you know, the next person needs to jump on and kick you off the air, you can have a little leeway. So, you know, if you have a regular podcast that goes out weekly and maybe it's half an hour is your base, but some weeks it's 35 minutes, 40 minutes.
Content based too, isn't it, Michelle? Like how it's got to be engaging, like if the content's good.
Yeah. And, you know, some weeks, so like My Favorite Murder, for example, they'll talk about 2. So each of the girls presents a different murder each episode. and it generally runs for an hour, but some of those will run for an hour and a half if it's a really detailed story that they want to tell. So, you know, you don't want to restrict yourself too much. But
thanks, Michelle. I think you're very right, and so is Joe. Because Teacher's Pet is, I'm sure you've heard of Teacher's Pet, you know, Hedley Thomas crime podcast. And that runs each episode about 50 to 60 minutes, whereas there are some others that start and stop between 20, 25 minutes. So thank you. Thank you to both of you.
no worries. Any other questions?
What about 6 minutes, ladies, before we have to wrap up? So if there's any other questions. Yep.
Charmaine?
I just wanted to say thank you to Michelle and Joe for presenting this podcast today. Michelle, your content and your screenshots have been extremely educational. Joe, thank you for setting it all up. I finally get to see and meet you after all of the correspondence we've had. It's good to see Michelle and Seema and Maureen here as well. I have my own website and I've been running Diva Head Wraps. This is my 6th year. And I've been seriously thinking about an additional platform to add to my website. So I do have my own website, and I'm going to investigate this idea about actually putting on a podcast. I'm actually maybe thinking of doing it at maybe 15 minutes, no longer than that. I want my content to be punchy and also engaging. And I do send out a blog twice a month. But I feel with this additional method, it will also engage people. They can be cooking and still listening. It's not, that's what I want to say about podcasts. What I find about it is you don't have to be looking at anything. You just have to be listening. And I feel that one of the things that's lacking today is actually listening skills. We've become such a visual audience that we can't relate to anything anymore about just listening to it. I come from a background where we never had a television, and the only way for me to engage was to engage via radio. But I think podcasts is the way to go. And I'm extremely keen to explore that area. I'm also extremely keen to see how WOW is going to present this on their platform. I just want to wrap up and say COVID-19 has been extremely creative for the whole community. And ordinarily, I would not be engaging in this on a Saturday morning, but my goodness, I'm just so stoked. So again, thank you for having me, and thank you for putting this up. Yeah.
No worries at all.
Charmaine.
Just to clarify, because we had another question, we will be sending the slides plus links Michelle has, and possibly a small feedback form for us just to see how you enjoyed it, what you got out of it, and if you want to know more, because we'll be continuing to talk with Kathy and the team at WOW about what other content we can contribute to the well. And if you haven't already, definitely go on to the wowaustralia.com.au website and check out the well, because there's some fantastic content already and it's being added to on a weekly basis. So lots of cool stuff to read, look, listen, shop, and the rest of it.
And I can't wait to see what some of you might come up with if you start to do podcasting. And yeah, I'm around for feedback if you know, you want to send through recordings. I won't be like your friends and family. I can be a harsh critic if you need me to. So yeah, Joe can help with that.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we will hopefully see you on Wednesday. Wednesday's session is at 6 o'clock. This is more for the other side. This is if you've got a story to tell. How do you get media to listen? Do you want to elaborate slightly, Michelle, on that? And then yeah, we'll wrap it up.
So this is one I've kind of developed with CMTO that's a little bit more about, you know, women getting their word out. So, you know, be it, you know, if you're an artist, a community member who has topics that you want to discuss. So it's about, you know, how you can engage with media and get some coverage. So I look forward to seeing all your beautiful faces again on Wednesday night if you can make it.